Archivist Mira Kellow had broken the oldest law of the Threnn Assembly. And she knew it the moment the courtroom doors sealed shut behind her. The chamber was silent except for the low hum of the judgment ring. A circle of pale light above the heads of 9 elders, each older than her homeworld's recorded history. Each staring down at her with grief, wearing the mask of anger. Through the chamber's transparent wall, she could see it, a human vessel, small and unremarkable, drifting toward the assembly's sealed border, unaware it was sailing toward a death sentence written 6,000 years before its crew was born. "You transmitted the activation signal," said Elder Vashtu Orn, his voice carrying the terrible calm of someone who had delivered the same accusation 1,000 times across 1,000 years. "You woke something the covenant of silence forbade us from ever acknowledging again." "I answered a distress call," Mira said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. "A ship was dying. I had the means to save it. I used them." "You had the means to condemn an entire species," Vashtu said. "There is a difference, Archivist, though I understand why you cannot yet see it." But none of this had begun in a courtroom. It had begun 4 days earlier, in the quiet dark of the Threnn Assembly's outermost listening post, where nothing interesting had happened in over a century. Mira had taken the posting at Outpost Calyx 7, precisely because nothing ever happened there. After 11 years cataloging the Assembly's oldest archives, records so ancient half her colleagues doubted their authenticity, she'd wanted quiet. Calyx 7, on the edge of a region charted only as the Fallow Reach, offered exactly that. Her job was simple: monitor a few dozen dormant relay beacons, verify nothing drifted into restricted space, and file a report nobody read. She had been 3 years into that quiet routine when the signal came. It was faint, fractured, barely readable through the interference of a dying engine core, but unmistakably a distress call, transmitted in a language pattern her linguistic database had never catalogued before. Not Threnn, not any of the 11 member species of the Assembly. Something entirely new, proprical was clear. Any unidentified signal near the Fallow Reach's inner boundary was to be logged, encrypted, and forwarded to Assembly Central without response, without acknowledgement, without contact of any kind. It was the oldest standing order in the Assembly's charter, and every outpost officer swore to honor it. Mira had sworn that oath. She broke it in under 4 minutes. The truth stunned her when her console finally parsed the fractured transmission. It wasn't a warship, wasn't anything resembling the Leviathans described in the Assembly's most restricted records. It was a single small survey vessel, the UNS Meridian Hope, crew of 6, reactor bleeding radiation, life support failing, its distress call looping for hours with no expectation anyone was listening. "Central relay override," she murmured to herself, hands hovering over the console. "Just forward it. That's the protocol. That's all you have to do." She thought of the 11 years buried in Assembly archives. Translating fragments of a history so heavily redacted entire centuries had been erased. She thought of the strange gaps in the oldest files. A species designation appearing exactly twice in 6,000 years, both times followed by catastrophic purges of related records. Someone, long ago, had made sure nobody would ever ask what the Assembly had done, and to whom that required this much forgetting. Then she thought of 6 people dying alone in the dark, because a rule older than memory told her not to answer. She opened a return channel. "Unknown vessel, this is Outpost Calyx 7 of the Threnn Assembly. We hear your distress call. Please transmit your coordinates and the nature of your emergency. Help is coming." That wasn't even the biggest mistake she'd make that day, though she wouldn't understand the full weight of it until much later. The response, when it came 6 minutes afterward, carried a voice that sounded exhausted, human, and disbelieving in equal measure. "Calyx 7, this is Lieutenant Ayana Voss of the UNS Meridian Hope. We didn't think anyone was out here. Our reactor's failing, we've got maybe 6 hours of life support left and our drive core is too damaged to jump. Please, if you can send help. Transmitting your coordinates to Assembly Rescue Command now," Mira said, already keying the emergency dispatch protocol. already knowing with sick certainty that Assembly Rescue Command would refuse the request the moment they saw which species had made it. She was right. The response from Assembly Central arrived within the hour, terse and absolute. No rescue authorized. Contact with unidentified vessel is a violation of the Covenant of Silence. Archivist Kellow is to cease all communication immediately and await Assembly security escort for formal review. Mira stared at that message a long time. Then she did the only thing that made sense, the thing that would land her in the judgment chamber facing elders who remembered a war she'd never been taught existed. She launched Calyx 7's single emergency shuttle, loaded with power cells and life support parts, and set a course to meet the Meridian Hope herself. Nobody knew what waited for her aboard that ship until she docked, 4 hours later, and found 6 exhausted, frightened people who had spent the last several hours preparing themselves to die quietly in the dark rather than face whatever horror the sudden silence from Assembly Central seemed to promise. "You came," said Lieutenant Voss, staring at Mira's environment suit with open astonishment once the airlock cycled. "We thought," the message just stopped. "We thought we'd made contact with something that decided we weren't worth saving." "You made contact with an archivist who broke a dozen laws to get here," Mira said, moving to help stabilize their reactor. "We can discuss consequences later. Let's keep you alive first." It took 6 more hours of exhausting work. Mira's engineering knowledge stretched thin against technology she'd never studied. Before the reactor stabilized enough to sustain the crew until rescue arrived. By the time Assembly security caught up with her, towing both vessels back under armed escort, what she'd learned from Voss unsettled her far more than the prospect of her own punishment. Humanity, it turned out, had no idea the Threnn Assembly existed. Their survey mission was a routine deep space mapping expedition, thousands of light years from their nearest colony, run by a species that had never once been warned to stay away, because as far as their frontier command knew, this region of space was empty. "That's impossible," Mira said, more to herself than to Voss. "The Covenant exists because of a war. A war with your species. That's what the oldest records imply, even with everything redacted. How can there be a war neither side remembers starting?" Everything changed in the next few seconds, because it was at that exact moment that Elder Vashtu Orn's personal vessel arrived to take formal custody of both ships. And the look on the old elder's face when he first saw the Meridian Hope's hull markings told Mira everything she needed to know. Whatever the truth was, it terrified him. The trial was not the swift formality Mira had expected. It stretched across 3 days, elder after elder interrogating her, examining the black box records, conferring in private sessions she was barred from. On the 3rd day, standing again before the judgment ring, Vashtu finally gave her the answer she'd been demanding. 6,000 years ago, he said, his ancient voice heavy with a weariness that seemed to predate language itself, the species you now call human nearly ended the Threnn Assembly's existence. Not through conquest, through kindness. Mira blinked. That doesn't make sense. It never does, to those who weren't there. Vashtu's projection shifted, revealing fragments of records so old their encoding had degraded into ghostly static. 6 millennia passed, our ancestors made first contact with a young struggling species, clawing its way off a single world, fractured by war, poverty, disease. We offered them nothing, not out of malice but doctrine. The Assembly believed intervention corrupts a species' natural development. We watched them suffer from orbit and called it wisdom. And humanity found out. Mira said slowly. A single ship discovered our listening post above their world by accident. Vashtu confirmed, his voice catching on a memory older than Mira's entire civilization. Rather than demanding tribute, rather than seeking conquest, they did something no species in Assembly history had ever done. They helped anyway. Defied their own leadership's caution, shared medicine, shared restrained technology, and asked for nothing but friendship. The Council had made a terrible mistake, Mira realized, watching the old elder's expression crack open, with a grief that had clearly festered, unspoken, for 6,000 years. That should have been a triumph, she said. A first contact that went right. Why would that become something the assembly needed to erase? Because it exposed us, Vashtu said, real shame entering his ancient voice for the first time. Their unconditional compassion revealed the cruelty of our own doctrine in a way our society could not survive acknowledging. Younger assembly members began questioning the covenant itself, demanding we intervene in conflicts we had coldly observed for centuries. Rather than admit our doctrine was wrong, the elders of that era erased the humans from our history instead, sealed the records, silenced the witnesses, decreed that no member of the assembly would ever acknowledge that species again. The truth stunned the entire chamber into silence, because it was clear from the faces of the younger elders present that even most of them had not known this history until this trial forced it into the light. You buried them, Mira said, disgust rising despite the danger of speaking so plainly. Not because they threatened you, but because their kindness shamed your cruelty. Then you built a law forbidding anyone from ever discovering that shame again. Vashtu did not deny it. Yes, and now their descendants are here again, Mira said, dying in the dark on your border, and your answer was still silence. You'd have let 6 people suffocate rather than risk anyone, remembering what you did to their ancestors. Nobody knew what the human lieutenant was hiding until Voss, permitted to speak for the first time, rose and addressed the judgment ring directly, her voice steady despite the weight of the history she'd just heard. We don't remember any of this, she said. Not the first contact, not the help you're describing, not any of it. Whatever happened 6,000 years ago, it's gone from our history too. Maybe your covenant didn't just erase your own records. Maybe it reached further than you realize. The chamber went very still. It was Elder Yasen Thor, youngest of the 9 and long-rumored the Covenant's quietest critic, who finally spoke into the silence. If that is true, then the Covenant did not merely bury a shameful history, it severed a friendship that once nearly reshaped this assembly for the better, and did so without either side knowing what was lost. The Queen, for Yasen held, beneath her council title, the Assembly's ceremonial sovereignty, a line older than the Covenant itself, suddenly froze, staring at the human lieutenant with an expression the chamber hadn't witnessed in 6,000 years, genuine, unguarded hope. Archivist Kellow broke our oldest law, Yasen said, turning to address the full judgment ring. She also proved something the Covenant spent 6 millennia trying to convince us was impossible. That this species' compassion was never a threat to be silenced. It was a gift we were too afraid to accept the first time. I will not make the same mistake twice. The debate that followed lasted another full day, bitter and unresolved in places, older elders clinging to doctrine that had defined their lives against younger voices, pushing for a reckoning 6,000 years overdue. In the end, it was a single question Mira posed to the chamber that settled it. You've spent 6,000 years afraid of what their kindness might cost you, she said. Has hiding from it made you any less ashamed, or has it only made the shame older? No elder answered her directly, but when the vote came, it was 7-2 in favor of formally reopening contact with humanity. And rescinding, for the first time in 6 millennia, the covenant of silence that had governed the Threnn Assembly's entire relationship with the outside galaxy. Mira's own punishment was almost an afterthought by comparison, a formal reprimand, followed by an unprecedented appointment, as the Assembly's first liaison archivists to humanity, tasked with rebuilding a bridge history had once tried, and failed, to keep apart forever. Months later, standing beside Voss aboard a newly commissioned assembly vessel, bound for humanity's nearest colony, Mira found herself thinking not of the trial, or the elders, but of the simple, stubborn decision that had started it all. Do you ever regret it? Voss asked her. Breaking the law to answer our call? Mira considered the question with the same care she'd once given the Assembly's oldest, most carefully hidden archives. The elders spent 6,000 years afraid that kindness could break something, she said finally. They were right. It broke their silence. It broke their shame. I don't regret being the one who finally led it. Behind them, the stars stretched toward a future neither species had been permitted to imagine. Proof, at last, that even the oldest, Most carefully guarded silence cannot survive forever against someone who simply refuses to look away.